Welcome to the Anchored Podcast. Have you ever wondered how to stay grounded in your faith amid heartache, confusion, and a seemingly mass exodus of people leaving the faith? My name is Roseanne Dawes.
And I'm Stephanie Frankham. And we've discovered that being anchored in Jesus Christ is the key to navigating these rough waters. Join us as we explore how their faith and covenants have helped each of our guests navigate the storms of life. Welcome back to the Anchored Podcast.
We are so excited to meet with a guest that I am just getting familiar with, and Stephanie knows more about him. And we're so excited to have Seth with us today. Stephanie, tell us a little bit about Seth.
I would be happy to. Well, welcome, Seth. Seth, actually, I've only known him for a couple of years. I met him through my daughter. But the reason is because he has helped me. I don't even know how to say this, but he does NRT, and I'll have him explain just a little bit and in just a moment. But he has basically taken me from barely being able to roll over in bed without causing excruciating pain to playing pickleball 6 days a week. And the reason that we actually invited him on the podcast is because he and I have had some pretty deep conversations while he's been working with me over the last couple of years, and I love his testimony. And so, Seth, will you just tell us a little bit about you, including what NRT even is, and a little bit about your family and what you love to do and that type of a thing?
Sure. So NRT stands for Neural Reset Therapy. I actually came across it about almost 8 years ago now. I had been looking for a modality to approach a certain aspect of my therapy based on physiological law, because I love my laws and principles. And so I'd been praying actually to either develop it or find it. And lo and behold, I saw this little YouTube clip, and I'm like, that looked like it produced a really good effect for a really little amount of work. So my cynicism kicked in. And for me, and this has a lot to do with how I have stayed in the faith also, when I experience cynicism, there's a meta check that kicks in, which is if I am repulsed by this, or I'm like, oh no, that can't be it because it's too easy, I investigate. And yeah, so that's what led me to it. And a lot of NRT is based on making sure that you get enough chaos and confusion in your life. And I know that might sound kind of weird, but we have a neurological appetite for change and variety, just like we have one for stability and repetition. And with the proper techniques, applying the principles of a few physiological laws that facilitate adaptation under healthy duress, you can get some good nerve response, and that's about it.
Can I just say one thing? I mean, this is how weird it is, okay? Because Kendall just said, "Oh, this is amazing. You've got to try this." And like, okay, I'm willing to try it once. Well, I go in and you're on the table and he comes and he reaches back to feel something in my rib cage, and it hurt. It's like, you kind of want to kick him, but I was being polite and I didn't. And it hurt. Okay, so then he goes about this other thing with just a little bit of soft resistance and works on the other side of the body. And we're talking like maybe moving my leg or I don't even remember. But he comes back, it wasn't more than, I don't know, three little dumb things he did. And he comes back and digs his fingers back in there again. That's how it felt the first time. Did not hurt at all. And I immediately, I'm like, what did you just do to me? I think, what did you tell me it was?
I joke. I say like it's face sorcery or just some. My sister Becca used to watch the BBC show Merlin, and whenever something magical happened, like the king or like the folk, like the common folk would be like sorcery, and so that was the joke. I did that. I tried that therapy on her once or twice, and she was like sorcery, and so that's what I joke that it is. Even though I know that's a pretty heavily loaded word in our faith, for those that have a sense of humor, that's what I call it jokingly. So
But it is amazing. It is
yeah.
amazing. Okay, sorry, you keep going.
So I am the second youngest of 9 children. My parents were both from a pretty strict Catholic family or families growing up. And in that family line, there was a lot of questioning of the faith, seeking for truth, a lot of, let's say, general distrust of authority figures and the patriarchy to a degree, especially I think it was a grandma a couple of generations back. And so a lot of cynicism. And my parents, when they investigated the church, one of their major concerns is they started to question things, especially about the organization of family and the function of gender in relationship to post-life, which they were taught, you lose your gender, you don't have family organization afterwards, you're angelic beings, and you're raptured, basically. Or, sorry, that's a loaded term, but you have a degree of paradisical glory where those things either don't matter, they don't exist. And that actually unsettled them a good amount. And so they pursued that questioning, and eventually it led them to the faith. More importantly, my dad was working with a fellow who just seemed happy and chipper all the time. And he was a member, and that led to their conversion. They were taught by a missionary that I believe was almost his mid-20s. And he was a little bit late going out into the mission field according to the culture of the church, but when he made it, he definitely made a huge difference in our family. Um, and so they converted, and I was raised in the faith. And I don't want to go too much into that because I wasn't active from the age of about 9 to 21, 22 almost. Um, During that time, well, speaking of myself a little bit, so I have had a pretty intense like health issue throughout my life, which only in the last few years we've actually come to figure out what it is. I actually have a intracranial dermoid cyst that grows and ruptures, and it's located in between my cerebellar vermis and right next to my brainstem. And so in my youth, especially, I remember having a lot of pain all the time. And of course, you're young, it becomes relative, but it's always something that's been able to take my entire life and start to spin it down the drain. And so there's always been this factor in my life that could change if the conditions were right or wrong, and it would just take me on a ride. And that definitely affected a lot of the opposition I had growing up. And yeah, that was my youth mostly to a degree. I can go into more detail about that later. But at the age of 19, I met a gal. I was with her for a few years, got divorced, and then had a good Alma the Younger experience throughout that window. And by the time I was 22, I became active in the faith and spent about 6 years single, working on myself, trying to improve, trying to learn from some hard lessons. Met my current wife. We got married in the Winter Quarters Temple in Omaha. Or technically it's not in Omaha, it's right outside of Omaha. Yeah, so we lived in Orem for a bit, moved to South Dakota, then moved to Malad, Idaho, where we're at now. And we've had 4 kids and a lot of interesting ups and downs. This is also her second marriage. So we've been able to work through the opportunity of like, that when you're on turn 2, there are some things you're like, nope, this is a me problem, like stuff like that. And so that's been pretty great. And since I was 17, I went to massage therapy college at the Omaha School of Massage Therapy. It was a 1,000-hour program. And so I actually went there for 750 hours. Then I went back to South Dakota, practiced for a few years because it was only a 500-hour school or 500-hour licensure state at the time. And then after my divorce, I went back, had to take a few basic classes over again, which was a lot of fun. And then I finished the full program and was in Omaha back and forth between South Dakota, Omaha, stuff like that. And throughout my career, I have absolutely loved it. There's a lot of things in the gospel that when it comes to the healing arts, just apply directly. And one of my favorite songs of the faith is Lord, I Would Follow Thee, because in the 3rd verse it says, I would be my brother's keeper, I would learn the healer's art. To the wounded and the weary, I would show a gentle heart. And it really impressed me. There are things throughout my career that just really impressed on me, and that was one of them, is that I can get really nerdy and really intense with like the science and the technique and explaining stuff, all that jazz. But if that gentle heart isn't there, that empathy, if that vulnerability and connection isn't there, then things can really go sideways. You can give so much, but without that there, usually cause a degree of suffering more than what's required. So and I'm a big fan of suffering. When I was younger and I wasn't engaged in the faith, but my parents still had boundaries about me attending church. So I would go to church and I would bring my Wheel of Time books and my other science fiction novels and just read that, get sassed pretty intensely by some women that I grew up with that I absolutely love and adore now. And I spent the rest of my time studying most of the other faiths and philosophies. Like when you guys asked about why I'm in the faith, I've talked and I've chatted with a lot of friends and a lot of my teachers growing up too, even the ones that taught me Sunday school. Some of them have left the faith, or I'd say almost more accurately, they've had to create boundaries with some of the negative aspects of our culture. And that boundary has created some space from the organization of the faith. And oftentimes it's come from that aspect of whether it's the family they grew up in or they were experiencing something unique to them that their families or the members couldn't relate to. That disconnect, that avoidance of suffering or not knowing how to, or even being willing to try and being really bad at it, which is really important because nobody's really good at it. One guy was. But that aspect really affected my life. And I studied other faiths and philosophies a lot because I remember going through one of the manuals and speed reading Brigham Young's Teachings of the Presidency's book. And he talked about, and I think it's the second or third chapter, how all truth belongs to our faith. And it's our job to go out there, to take it, to glean it away from the dross, and to integrate it into our practices and our faiths. And when I read that was one of the few times when I was younger, I felt such a strong spiritual impression. And it was one of the few things that I'd really been impressed on. So I did. So that was my youth. And even now, I really thoroughly enjoy and love engaging with people in different faiths, because in the end, it's not really that different. Like some of the fundamental aspects of our faith is honesty, effort, and, agency. And so whenever you're dealing with a faith, all you ever have to do is view things through that lens and be like, hey, like, honestly, where are you at? Like, what do you find to be true? What do you struggle with? What do you have to put effort in? What's easy for you also? And then what's keeping this from being a choice in your life? And that oftentimes, like having talked with a lot of people that have left the faith, not having it be a choice at the right times when they needed it to be a choice, it was a huge part of what they experienced in a negative way. And so dealing with other faiths, a lot of fun, especially when it's a food-based faith too. I'm not going to lie, I really enjoy my Muslim, my Sikh, and my Jewish friends. I miss the East Coast a lot because they would feed me really, 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 really well. And I just thoroughly enjoy when people of their own free will and volition, with love in their heart, worship God and celebrate him.
So Seth, I'm so curious to hear though. I've only known or heard this just the smallest amount, and you said that you pretty much you weren't active in the church from the time you were 9 until
Oh
what,
yeah,
I think you said 21. Did you say 12?
about 21, 22. So
Okay, 21 to 22. But I'm curious, a couple of things there. I want to know why, and I want to know what your life looked like during that time and how your family was dealing with that.
Okay. So in my perspective, I remember the first time I how do I put this? I even from a young age, I had a really hard time with people pleasing and seeing people pleasing behavior out of people. If someone was disingenuous like that, like I'd feel like this revulsion. And I think it has to do with the example of honesty my parents had. My parents were both converts. They came from pretty strict Catholic families, or at least intense ones. And so they had a lot of stuff to work through, but my parents were always super honest about what they were struggling with, whether, you know, whether something needed to change or not. And that actually was a huge part of my coming back to the faith later on, was seeing the dynamic changes and growth the gospel performed on my parents. Huge part of that. But when I was younger, it was really hard to feel thing beyond the pain, and most of the way that I coped with pain growing up was trying to find patterns in things. So like I became really hypersensitive to that. And in the ward I had growing up, I didn't find out till later, but we had a lot of people in our ward that came from really rough backgrounds. And so they were trying their best, but I noticed a lot of what it felt like back then was either double standards or hypocrisies, um, or being taught something that wasn't being applied. And I can recognize now that I was super sensitive to that stuff because I was very much an existential pattern-based learner. And I could be like, okay, well, you're forcing this on me, like I don't have the choice to be here. Like I just didn't feel it, you know? And interestingly enough, as I came back to the church and I got to know those people and their stories later, the scale of which those people improved their lives through the gospel, but even from the family backgrounds that they came from and what they experienced growing up, like for me, it was good to better, better to best. And even some of those people that were that example growing up, some of them don't have contact with some of their kids, because the scale of what they experienced from bad to good to better was still really rough on their kids. And that I think is one of the hardest things that we have to deal with nowadays is when we do our best and it doesn't scale for our kids. And for me growing up, that scaling was an issue. Also at the same time, I really didn't let myself feel a whole lot of emotion because most of it was pain related. And if I let myself feel it, then it completely overwhelmed me. So it was really easy for me to get super anxious or depressed. And so I did cope with a lot of my physical symptoms by cerebral compensation and by just trying to shut off most feelings, which was hard because I was also a super empathetic and sensitive kid. So that was a lot of it. And I didn't feel it. And growing up, there was a lot of honesty and communication about, getting a testimony and those feelings, those keywords based around that type of experience. I didn't have it. I didn't feel it. I didn't want it. So, and I was a bit of a turd. So I told my parents, it was a pretty young age. It was around the time they were concerned about me up until about the age 11. And around the age of 11, I'm just like, hey, I'm not going to get any further advanced in the priest. And they're like, why? What's going on? And my response is, well, I don't feel it and I'm not going to be a hypocrite. And that's all the answer I would give, and we'd have the typical like parent child interaction where if they pushed, I'd be an absolute turkey. It was a bit intense for my parents growing up. But as they say now, the one thing that they could expect out of me is that I'd always tell them the truth.
I can't
Yeah.
wait to hear how you've gone through this because it's just reminding me so much of, I've got one child who you describe so perfectly what he's experiencing now as an adult. And, he's was raised in the church. We taught him these things. He was made to go to church. But what you're saying is you always just got to the quick with truth. And I know he's a seeker and I know he wants to know. He's kind of just numbed himself. I don't know, but it just feels like there's just some numbing going on because it is painful, and it's so interesting. I'm just so amazed at how many parallels there are here, even with Buddhist tradition and whatnot, because this same child married a gal from India.
Oh, nice.
And her dad there was one time just 2 years ago where the baby was born. And so I met him. They were there and we were going to bless the baby and whatnot. And he always just went to his heart. He was always just point to his heart. He doesn't speak very clear English. It's hard to understand him. But I asked him one time, I'm like, how do you deal with your children were converted there in India. They came over, 18, 19 years old, and they married here in the States. They don't plan on going back to India. You might see them once or twice in a year, if that. How do you do that? And he said something about Buddha, and he said something about that attachment is all bring together in stuff, the suffering because of attachment. And Heavenly Father has led me for the past 2 years of understanding what that actually means and how much letting go there has to be in allowing them to have their own story and their journey and whatnot. But you give me hope in what you've experienced, that he is interested. He just wants to know the truth. He just wants to know what, if he doesn't feel it, he is not going to invest in that. But I don't know that he had the courage, or he just had an obstinate mom that just said, yes, you are. You're going to.
That could be a bit rough. So
right. So I love this so much. So Seth, we've kind of asked you to kind of give us your story and tell us what, through the story, how your covenants have kept you anchored in Christ. And we're excited to hear that. So we're just going to turn the time over to you. And Stephanie, I might just kind of pop in with questions here and there because I'm curious.
That's probably good. So I was baptized, and I remember feeling the Spirit when I was, even though it was hard to. It was hard to feel that confirmation compared to what I felt normally, So it wasn't like this big experience, feeling freshly clean. It was like, oh, no, confirmation. That was a good thing to do. That was about it, But for me, we were talking earlier. I was really honest with my parents and stuff, mostly because I learned from observation from my older siblings. There was a lot of expert debaters and stuff in my older siblings. I'm the second youngest in 9, like I mentioned, and I saw what didn't work, and I saw what wasted time and, or wasted emotional energy. And that was a huge part of why I communicated like I did. But also, like, a lot of younger siblings too, or middle kids, sometimes in families, especially like when older kids, there's a lot of stuff. Like it's really easy to kind of feel alone, or like the meshing of the family dynamic really isn't there. Hard to get along, hard to feel stuff, you know. And I know that stuff now was amplified by a lot of my health issues. We don't know how many times I've either had encephalitis or meningitis from the cyst in my brain. But I had it a lot, and the symptoms I had as a kid where they'd take me either to the hospital or the clinic and they'd be like, we have no idea what's going on. Like he's probably just really sick, you know? But when stuff like that happen and you're in pain all the time, like you're looking for connections, especially when you're experiencing things differently than everyone else around you. And I'll wholeheartedly admit I am much more sensitive and I'm much more of an almost automatic advocate of people that experience life differently, that don't fit into the regular framework or the structuring of the church or the culture of it, I should say. And so for me growing up, I looking for a lot of connection was what I was doing, looking to not have pain and to be connected. And so that actually led me to eventually going to school for massage therapy because I wanted to be able to do stuff with my hands, be in practice within a year, and help people out. In my mind, it was a healing art. And I like to go back to the basics before I build anything advanced. And so I'm like, all right, well, it feels like I need more physical touch in my life in a healthy way. This is a good avenue for it, you know? So I went to massage therapy college, came back early, and then I was back and I met my ex-wife, and she grew up in a pretty intense family dynamic too. Her parents were split, and her mom was able, she did a lot for her daughter, probably to the point of overreach and doing too much. And so there was a really intense dynamic. And I remember the first time my ex said something that was kind of a red flag, and I was not, like, I had rose-colored glasses, so all flags looked, the same color to me. And so that got me into a relationship where, like we lived together and we got married, But at the beginning of it, I remember one of those red flags. I remember getting this feeling that it was this was a definite path in the road. And I remember I actually was on ADHD meds for the first time. And I remember taking them for the first time. And it actually helped a lot because my body, I didn't know, doesn't produce dopamine pretty well, because of all the stuff going on with me. And so I had been diagnosed with ADHD, back then, and I was on meds for it. And it was the first time I really focused on stuff, and that actually helped me feel a little bit more too. I had to go off of it within a year because it ended up giving me horrible sleep patterns. But I remember during that time, I was actually really engaged in seeking truth, and it was in other aspects, other faiths, studying them, pondering them, trying to apply their philosophies in my life and figuring out what the product was. And I remember to praying to Heavenly Father, hey, like, should I marry this person, or should I continue on this path? And I got one of those direct verbal promptings of, no, no, you shouldn't. And it's not because she's a bad person. It's not because of anything you'll do, but her choices make this or will make this a bad idea, or it was just a no. And I got angry and stubborn instead of submissive and soft. And I remember my response was, well, you know what? I'm going to do this myself. I'm going to make this work. And at that point, Heavenly Father, in the most lovingly way possible, cursed my life for my sake. And he let me know exactly what it would feel like and where I would end up and where I ended up to try to do things on my own and make it work. And for me, that was hell by the end of it. I was so miserable. My friends could see it. My family could see it. And we were both miserable too. Like it's so easy post marriage to cast blame and stuff like that. And it's just like, no, like I definitely took on a parental role in the relationship, trying to make it work too, amped that up. And I could not respect her in the way she needed to be respected. And it went vice versa too. We wanted completely different things. And there was a lot of people pleasing in that dynamic too. For, stuff like that. She said she wanted kids. She didn't want kids. She said she wanted to get married. Didn't want to get married. Pretty important things. But at the same time, like as I'm older now, I'm like, you know what? That's how it goes. And then 2 years later, when she's like, I don't want to be married anymore, like I want to be able to do X, Y, Z, and I'm not happy. Like the pain over that course of time from the beginning with the prayer to the end of the marriage was so important because I wasn't willing to let myself feel it. And I was really covering with coping and behaviors, a lot of video games back then too. Pain was not pain, but emotional pain, loneliness, stuff like that, all the stuff that can occur. And at that point, like Heavenly Father gave me a window where I was compelled to be humble, where as lovingly as possible, both him and my parents said the same thing. It wasn't an I told you so. It was, hey, we love you.
Were you seeking or did it just come?
In the beginning, I sought the answer for direction. And at the end, it was actually the same night my ex let me know she didn't want to be married. But I remember feeling angry so much. And it'd be over stuff like not not doing your chores, the stuff you agreed to do mostly,
Mhm.
And it was a cold, really intense day. I didn't get picked up for work because we had one car and I worked like 2 miles away from where we were living at a restaurant. So I went there, walked in the rain and snow, and worked. It was either a 10 or a 12-hour shift. And then I was waiting for her and she was 2 hours late. And I remember just fuming and being like, oh, like, like, what could I say to make this never happen again? Which is a huge meta check for me right now, especially in my second marriage and as a father. You don't ever do that. Never seek to make it known in such a way where they can't grow by an interval. or a small and simple step. But I remember just kind of just like ruminating over those feelings. And then my ex came, picked me up, and she's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry." Or sorry, it was before that. Before she got there, I was remember thinking and feeling these things. And it was the first time in probably a year and a half where I felt this spirit like really strongly. And that impression came to my mind, near the end, at the end, is Seth, if you love this person, you would never treat or say something like this. And I was like, oh, all right. And then I let it go. And I remember feeling the intensity, the anger, that intensity of wanting control, to not be hurt or disappointed, just going away,
So what were your spiritual practices at that time? I'm just curious about, for an impression to come like that, were you spiritually prepared on any level, or
Nope,
just
absolutely not.
Okay.
I was at the bottom of the barrel, and I was compelled to be humble, because right after that, or an hour after I got that impression, my ex, we're in the bathroom. I was on the bathtub. I was reading something, and I was just like cheering. It'd been years since I'd felt that way. And she started to cry. She was like, "Oh, like, why aren't you angry at me?" I'm like, "You know what? Like, I just want you to be happy, and me being a jerk like that, you can't be happy." And she's like, "Oh, okay, I want a divorce." And so that was it. So I went from probably a year and a half of the lowest that I've ever been in my life, not having really any of the benefits of my covenant because of my how do you say, what's the term from the Doctrine and Covenants?
Kicking
Oh,
against the pricks.
not even kicking against the pricks, but like it's where if you seek to hide your sins, or seek to, it's the second one in there, gratify vain ambition, something like that. It was a vain ambition that I was failing at wonderfully. And like by the end of it, like I had nothing, and I had no joy, no happiness. And I was so stubborn, I wasn't going to give up. I wasn't going to fail. And so my ex-wife wonderfully had the guts to be able to end it, because I never would have.
So were
And
you genuinely happy when you said, "I just want you to be happy," and you're just joyful? Like, were you?
oh yeah, for like a half second, then she said
Okay.
that, and then I felt like that horrible, wretched feeling in my gut where, and I call it, and I've called this since the first time I felt it in middle school. I call it the vomity cat syndrome, where it feels like there's a cat in your stomach that's throwing up and trying to bite its own tail. That kind of like horrible, like wretched. And I remember it was like I felt that for like a year and a half, and like that was it, and that was the end. And I just knew that the honesty mattered so much. And even though it took, and this is in hindsight, it took me a while to get there, but even though it took her a while to be completely honest with me like that, like it's so much better than if it never would have come.
Yeah.
And so that was the end. And so then I actually, we got all our stuff in order. We still lived with each other for like, I think it was 3 to 6 months afterwards. That area is kind of a blur, where it's just like, we can't really afford to do XYZ. And I was set myself up back at school to go finish off the last 250 hours. And then I did. And it was pretty rough, to have that type of pain. But in my life, like, pain comes, suffering's going to be there. And even if it's pain that's self-inflicted, don't let it go to waste. There's nothing worse than a waste of pain, especially self-inflicted pain, And I know that might sound kind of weird, but at the same time, one of the major things that really affected my development, and kind of still kind of makes me chafe sometimes within the culture of the faith, is I was taught during my early 20s and through a lot of the reading that I did, that Western religion really screws up a lot of stuff, specifically like with yoga, with Buddhism, with martial arts. And like they describe it like this: in the 60s and 70s, like when yoga and meditation really became popular, the Westerners saw it as this way to escape. where it's like, oh, we're gonna enlighten and we're gonna float up above the earth and we're gonna be like completely untouchable and life will be like raptured happy. And then you talk to an actual Buddhist, like from Thailand. We had a lot of people from a lot of different cultures growing up where I'm at. It was South Dakota, a town called Brookings. We had a state ag college, and we had a lot of people going there for family mental health services or education at the state college or agricultural stuff. I remember one gal, she was just like, you guys really use this stuff wrong, because mindfulness, meditation, all those practices are there, not so you can avoid the suffering, but so you can be present while you're suffering and you don't escape or hide from it.
How
And
did you get to that point, Seth, where you realized you weren't feeling anything as a teenager up to 22-ish? And then was it just the massage therapy, and that's when you started to feel and could actually embrace that a little bit more?
I felt a lot of it was like, teen angst and anger. All teenagers are low-grade narcissists. I'm just going to put that out there. And so, hey, look to the research. That's literally the category they belong into. But for me, I had a lot of empathy. I had a lot of care for my friends, just not a lot for myself. And that was the big issue, is entwined or enmeshed in the issue with me having my heart open towards the gospel was a lot of pain I had with myself. And so I could feel things, but it wasn't joy and suffering, you know?
Well, I'm not there yet where I find joy in the suffering.
I'm not really there yet either. I get there every now and then. And as my wife will say, I'm the most insufferable whenever I am there. But but that just is the experiencing of it. And in the end, what opened up my heart and my emotions was having a pain I couldn't escape from. There was a consequence for the choices that I made up until that point, how I interacted and engaged with someone, and most of it, probably the best way to describe it, is that I ended up being her dad instead of her partner, or a parent instead of a partner, which might seem like, oh, that's pretty normal. But in my opinion, that's one of the worst forms of emotional abuse that can occur in a relationship. Even if you're both coming from sides, predisposition for that. That was not, and to gain from doing that in that area and to escape from it, not wanting spiritual impression, like, hey, if you don't let yourself out, it's going to happen and again and again. And I did, and I just sat in it. It's crappy. But at the like, that was one of those spiritual impressions where it's like, just lean into it. Don't waste this, buddy. If you're going to be compelled to be humble, don't make the habit of it. Not that I escaped that, but I did a relatively better job. So,
no,
yeah.
I love that so much because, you're talking about different modalities, and it wasn't until, because I was a teacher, and I grew up in the gospel with, this is just what you do. And I was very obedient and dutiful. This is just what we do. And we receive these blessings if we do this. But it wasn't until I was, I taught school for 8 years.
Yeah.
And then through a series of events, I got introduced to body talk and other modalities and became certified in like 15 different modalities. But it was such an interesting experience getting into that because it was so non-traditional of what I grew up with. And I just remember one time I was in a session with someone, and and she was just muscle testing my arm, and she drops my arm and she goes, this has come to me 3 times, but do you want to learn how to do this? And my mind and everything said no, but what came out of my mouth was yes.
Yeah.
And then it was just miracle after miracle to be able to pay for those certifications and travel across the country to get those certifications. But I've always wondered why I was led in that direction, because I know that was not me that said that. That was just the Lord speaking through me. But what I have learned through that is I had no idea that I didn't know how to feel.
Yeah.
And through the modalities and sitting with it and feeling it in your body, and I really feel like I was just in my head all the time.
Yeah. That's where I was too.
Yeah. And so with body talk, it's just like your body is telling a story all the time. And do you feel it? But I have learned more about feeling those spiritual impressions. I would get the big ones, like, should I marry Brian? Yes. Like I would
Yeah.
get those big ones. But along the way, it was these different Eastern medicine modalities and different things to just open me up to feeling and understanding and it's just been an incredible journey the past decade.
Yeah. And that is, in my opinion, that is a fundamental truth, is that eventually you have to get into the body and the heart and let go of the brain. And one thing that I've learned, especially through suffering with people doing massage, even just listening to their life stories. I worked a lot in my mid-20s. I worked a lot with people that were either trafficked or victims of sexual abuse and military combatants.
Mm.
So a lot of CPTSD, a lot of PTSD. And to give any expectation without performing Christ-like suffering with them, because the worse you get into abuse, the more healing becomes self-driven, especially when there's no accountability on the opposite side, you know? And so, like, the first resource we should give is that gentle heart, is the Christ-like suffering of what he did for us in the Garden of Gethsemane. Not giving logic, which is something I've done in the past and I still struggle with as a dad, as a human, I should say, or fix-it stuff or platitudes, or that toxic positivity, like, oh, it'll be better later. I'm like, bull. You don't know that. You do not know that. I was told that so many times. And you know what? It's gotten harder. And if the joy and suffering had not gotten harder, then I don't know where I'd be, or, better. I wouldn't know where I'd be. But that's just it. Like those two things from education, that's what gets you into your heart. And when I was younger, another aspect of educational psychology, like I compensated and I coped with the pain that I had, especially not fitting in socially, by almost exacerbating that joy or that dopamine release that comes from self-exploration of a new subject. So like in education, like there's a different type of imprinting that occurs if you figured it out yourself,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
that is where I struggled with a lot growing up. I remember when I was 9, I remember thinking, I don't have to go to church. If what we believe is true, at some point, some spirit throughout all time and eternity, did it on their own. They had to have, that was my mindset growing up at the age of 9. And I'm like, yeah, I'll give it a try. That kind of set up for the stuff later. But it was that there is a degree of enjoyment or catharsis that comes from figuring out yourself, but that can be taken cerebrally into such a difficult way of living, because then you never really enjoy the benefit of believing on the testimony of someone else that's already been through it. So,
It
and
is
it's
so
hard to get
true.
there.
Yeah, and
So,
allow kids to have that
oh
experience,
yeah,
and allow them to learn on their own. And that's what Heavenly Father is teaching me, is just allow him. He's just telling me, butt out, Roseanne, just
yeah.
butt out. You don't need to let them have their experience. Yeah.
My mom, she shared with me before I received the Melchizedek priesthood. She shared with me, she's like, I wasn't going to tell you this right away when you became active, but I feel like it's time. But she was praying for me super hard, like during the worst parts of my marriage and then the divorce. And she was really worrying about it. And God gave her one of those direct verbal promptings, like, hey, out all your kids, don't worry about Seth. Like,
Yep.
you don't have
Yep.
to worry about Seth. And at that point, boom, she just quit worrying about me, because the worry really doesn't help, you
No,
know?
it actually weakens the other party.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
yeah, and it's rough too, because there's a lot of put this, issues with object permanence in our culture, like people, if you're not there, you don't exist. It's a
Mhm.
huge symptom of ADHD,
Mhm.
because some people with ADHD remember everything as a coping mechanism, and some people just kind of disassociate and they let go. So if you're not there causing stress or anxiety, you're not on that person's mind, which is really rough because it can create really intense family dynamics if that enters into play, especially with parents, because you don't want to just be worried about, you want to be cheered on, you want resources. Sometimes you want things fixed, but that's when as a parent, you'd be like, no, suffer. Which is what I say to my kids a good amount, as lovingly as possible, as long as they're in the mood for it. Like if they're crying or they're bleeding, like that's something different. But if it's
Seth,
just, oh,
sorry, you came back to the church,
yeah,
and I'm just sitting here thinking about, I mean, I know some of the things that have happened just in the last little while, over the last year.
yeah,
I would love if you would share a little bit about that, so
okay,
that, because I want to see these little anchor points coming together. I want to be able to see
yeah.
how coming back to the church, and then getting married to Katie, and then, to continue with your life and the things that just, oh my gosh, the suffering that you've been through over the last year.
Yeah.
Um,
So I had the cyst rupture and I had to start rehab over. When I was 19, I had a chiropractor over just my neck and he gave me a CVA. And then when I was 25, I broke my spine in 6 places and then exploded my rib cage. So I've had multiple times where I've had to go through pretty intense rehab. But this last year, my cytokine and my homocysteine levels were so high, and the inflammation in my brain and the cyst was so bad. Uh, Something happened. But basically, I couldn't speak, couldn't coordinate anything for the location of where the cyst is at. It affects balance, coordination, speech, respiratory stuff. And I ended up being hospitalized. I got life flighted up to Irmac, and it was pretty intense. They treated me for meningitis for the first time in my entire life, which was amazing. Because it's the first time in my life where I didn't have the pain in my brain, which was great. Uh, and so, we talk about the covenants and what I've been through. Um, when I found out I'd have to be on the walker again for a bit because I just could not balance, I could not coordinate, and I did not have the strength. I was on it for about 6 weeks before I went to a cane and then transitioned. Uh, but it was an opportunity, like every time I've had something like that take me down. When I was younger, I had my covenants, but I still fought a lot, and it was by degrees throughout my life where I just realized it's not worth the fight. If the pain is there, if this is going to take me down to nothing, then hey, I'm down at nothing. What can I do with God and with my covenants as the base to build me back up again? And it was the same thing with my relationship, like when I got divorced. I was broken down to nothing. I failed in my eyes horribly. And I had not yet learned to fall or fail forward, and I was doing it, just wasn't aware of it yet. And so like even this last year, like I was in the process of building our house. Um, and I wasn't doing it at the pace I wanted to. Little did I know I probably had meningitis and or encephalitis. So I was doing pretty good for having an untreated illness like that. And I did a great job, but just that perspective needed to change. And that's one thing I love about my covenants. We covenant to endure to the end, which oftentimes means being just completely taken down, or experiencing things in life that make us feel like we're treading in deep water. And so this last year, I was like, well, all right, here we go. I'm alive. I'm still here. Like, it was good. My covenants empowered me. And to be absolutely frank, too, I had a lot of people from a lot of different faiths praying and fasting for me. And I could feel the power and strength that comes from that, especially with healing. And they're people that I've suffered with, that I've been there for, and they were there to suffer with me. And that the suffering of Christ in that way is what empowers our covenants. And for me, the women in my life that have suffered with me, especially I can think of one growing up that was really, really blunt. She was from, I think it was Trinidad, but she would just say things bluntly to me. But the love and the caring that came with it allowed that to occur, and I absolutely love that aspect of my covenants, which is that the fact that it's been strengthened by strong, oftentimes very stubborn and hardworking women in my life. Um, And that led me to my wife. I remember when I got divorced, I had like a list of things I did not want. I did not want this and this and that. And when you're that black and white, especially post-divorce, God lets you experience that as you date and you court. But when you think and you desire in black and white, you get some pretty intense people your way. And they're great. I can't think of anyone that I dated post-divorce that I wouldn't enjoy playing a game with, like a board game or a card game, and that my wife wouldn't get along with. But by the time I met my wife, Katie, I desired four things. I wanted honest about her relationship with God, hardworking, not sarcastic, and attractive to me. And I got 3 out of 4. I got everything but the not sarcastic. But at the same time, like, she had been divorced. She was married to someone that had some issues too. And there was a lot of scarring there also. And, like, just like with me, like, there was stuff growing up with her family that, I will communicate the extent of criticism that I feel comfortable with when I refer to, I think it was Elder Oaks back in 1987. Doesn't work for me. Some of the stuff from both of our families, they don't work for either of us. So we've had to kind of pioneer into something new. And to do that with someone that's been through a lot of ups and downs, that's had a lot of hard issues, especially with her own health, it's kind of like we just take turns. Like, all right, when COVID hit, I was starting to really feel the consequences of the cyst issue, my health issue. And Katie had her degree, and she was just like, hey, I think I'm ready. And I've been telling her for years, like, if you want to be the primary provider and I do my stuff part-time and I do the homemaking, like, I'm ready. I have the stuff I stink in, like laundry. But cooking, yeah, I'm good on that. And so we swapped. And it was such a wonderful experience for both of us. And that's just it. It's another one of those things where it's not traditional, but it's what worked for us. It fits to the proclamation for a family. We are obligated to assist each other in those duties. We are much more like a traditional, maybe dirt farming family from the pre-1700s than we are post-1700s. But at the same time, like, my covenants and my relationship with her allowed that switch to be easy. We made less money. We, struggled, but she was honest. She told me what she wanted, and we put effort in that area. And now, it's been 4 years, but we are so much happier. And so that window also at the same time allowed me to experience what that's been going on with my health, and has allowed me to get to the point where I could be rebuilt from scratch. And if I was still pushing 40 to 60 hours a week doing massage and building and doing XYZ, I either would be dead or, I'd be in a worse state. The covenants you were talking earlier too, and I know we're already past an hour, but talking about that, I remember when I first became active, and I would designate drive for my friends a lot. And so many things that I was led to really focus on observing, like the word of wisdom, or things like that, all affected my health. And it was just crazy because I would read just anything that I could, and I would pray about it, and Heavenly Father would lead me to something that has prolonged my life, that has allowed me to live with less pain. And the only big struggle it felt like was, when you get older and, if you're not accurate in what you're treating or in what you're doing, you have to go from like, I'm going to do this, 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 and that to like, I will be a vegan for part of the year, to kind of clean up my system. I will do joint and mobility stuff. I'll do X, Y, Z. Now, instead of that, I'm like, oh no, I need to take care of inflammation and explode, like realizes. But all along that path, the covenant, especially to that stand in need of suffering or comfort, that stand in need of comfort, that Christ-like suffering has led me to more aspects and truth and self-care in my own life than I ever would have imagined. I wouldn't have gotten to know NRT. I wouldn't have done a lot of the dietary stuff I've done that has given me more time here on earth. And almost every single time, it's me getting out of my own way by letting go of my brain. And it's like my covenants have given me something to anchor onto, to put trust and hope in when I have to let go of the strength of my own mind, or just what I know to be functionally true in secular knowledge.
So Seth, can we ask you, this is our
Yes.
standard question,
Mhm.
okay? Why, with all of that from your background, with the suffering, with the testimony, faltering and then coming back, with the divorce, with the pain, with all of that, why do you stay in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints?
That's such a good question. I stay true to the faith. So by doing that, it keeps me within the structure of the church. It allows me to worship and to care for people I have nothing in common with, or that the only similarity is their worship in God, or what they believe to be God, or whatever higher power or no power. It does not matter, but my experiences that I had, especially with my conversion back to the faith, which was, to be absolutely honest, a bit Alma the Youngerish. I was compelled to be humble, and I had some pretty intense conversion experiences. But I found that it just does not matter if you're compelled or you're not. Everyone has their opposition. I would love to have known what it would be like not to have to go through those big up and down waves, through especially, even up until now sometimes too. But it doesn't diminish anything. I know the difference between policy and principle. I know the truth that the church teaches. I know enough from the beginning, from the end, to where I have fun with it. It's absurd. I love absurdity, and our faith is absurd. Christian faith is absurd. You're telling me you can worship or put your hope and faith in one person that existed thousands of years ago, and that he's the Son of God, and no one else has that same lineage to that degree. And just by believing and feeling like that, it can organize your life. It can allow you to be present through the worst emotional retching and pain you'll ever feel. And it actually makes a difference. You do that a couple times and you get a taste for it. Like, that's why I stick with it. I mean, I've lived without it. I've lived with it. Even with what I experienced in my conversion, I have struggled with my testimony and the faith because of the social constructs of it that just chafe me. I don't like being around people. I don't want to bring my kids to church. I got nothing for so long with young children in church. And a lot of that was, anxiety based, but so it goes. But it didn't matter to me. I had finally opened up, let myself feel everything, including those horrible internal narratives you can get when you finally have peace and quiet and they just start running through your head. And that is part of it. All those pains, all the intensity, I have chosen to have a reasonable expectation and value for, which is I was promised nothing in my covenants that those would not happen. I was promised nothing that there would ever be a sacrifice that would not be asked from me. I was promised nothing when it comes to temporal comfort. but I've been promised joy, and I've tasted it way too many times.
So this has just been so fascinating to me, and there's so many parallelisms, and I'm just like, I want to continue convert. There's
Yeah, I
so
gotcha.
much good
Thanks.
stuff there. And so we just appreciate you just hopping on our show today and just sharing your heart and the vulnerabilities and your weird perspective. It's it is unique, and we kind of we're peculiar people, and peculiar doesn't have to look like this, right? We just
Yeah,
be ourselves, and we get to learn with the Savior, and that's what our covenants do, is just keep this relationship with him, and we learn with him through the struggle, through the suffering, and learn to find joy in all of our circumstances. So thank you so much for sharing
you're
your
welcome.
story and your processes. We
Thank
appreciate
you,
that.
Seth.
Thanks.
And for our listeners, if you have a story that you would like to share about how your covenants have helped you to remain anchored in Jesus Christ, please reach out to us at anchoredinChristpodcast@gmail.com. We would love to hear your story. And please subscribe to the channel and share this episode with Seth, with your loved ones and those that might really be able to connect and resonate with them. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.